Welcome back, everybody. Today we're going deep, really deep into some Jewish folklore. And, it might surprise you a little bit. We're going to be talking about vampires, Jewish vampires, to be exact.
Oh, this is going to be fun.
It is. And to help us navigate all this, we've got this great article called The Soul, Evil Spirits, and the Undead, Vampires, Death, and Burial in Jewish Folklore and Law.
Quite a mouthful, but yeah, that's our guide for this deep dive.
It is. So it sounds like we've got folklore, but we've also got, like, some serious laws around how death is handled in Jewish tradition.
Right, exactly. And that's what's so fascinating about this. It's where those two things, the folklore and those laws, kind of intersect.
Okay, I'm intrigued. So to, connect these two things, what exactly are we looking at? Like, what's the source material here?
Well, this article really zeroes in on a scholar from the 16th century, Rabbi David ibn Abi Zimra, but he also went by Radbaz.
Radbaz, okay.
And, get this, he uses a vampire story to illustrate the importance of these burial laws.
Hold on. A vampire story to teach people about burial practices.
Yeah, you read that right. It's a pretty wild approach, right?
That's amazing. Okay, you've got my attention. But before we get to all the spooky stuff, can you give us a quick rundown of the Jewish burial laws that are, at the heart of this story?
Of course. So there are two key laws that are really central to this. The first one is swift burial. Like Deuteronomy actually mandates burial on the same day of death.
Wow, same day.
Yeah, it was a really big deal. Leaving a body unburied overnight, it was almost like, well, they called it a reproach unto God. It's like they were emphasizing that the body was sacred, even in death.
So it wasn't like, oh, we'll get to it when we get to it. It was like, this needs to happen now.
Exactly. It was really important. Okay, so that's the first one. Now, the second key law is the practice of shmira. That means guarding the corpse.
Shmira.
Yeah. Basically, from the moment someone dies, all the way until they're buried, the body has to be watched over constantly. And people take turns reciting psalms.
Wow, so it's not just about getting the burial done quickly. It's like there's this whole process of being present with the deceased.
That's a great way to put it. It definitely adds a real spiritual depth to it. Of course, there are a few exceptions to these laws, like to give people time to honor the deceased or to gather family. But overall, the focus is on swiftness and presence.
That makes sense. Okay, so we're about to get into a story about a Jewish vampire. This is where it gets really interesting, right?
Oh, yeah.
But before we do, can you kind of paint a picture of Jewish folklore for us? Like, are there any other figures in their tradition that, can help us wrap our heads around this idea of supernatural beings and vampires especially?
Definitely. You're probably familiar with some of these figures like Lilith or the Dybbuk.
I think I've heard those names, but remind me.
Okay, so Lilith, she's a female demon, and she preys on newborns and women in childbirth. Yeah, it's intense. But it really highlights how, death, especially for women, was seen as this really vulnerable time. And then you've got the Dybbuk. That's the spirit of a dead person, usually someone who is a sinner. And they can actually possess the living.
Oh, that's freaky.
Yeah. But both of these figures, Lilith and the Dybbuk, point to this belief in a spiritual realm that kind of overlaps with our world, especially during these times of transition, like death.
Okay, yeah. It's like the veil between worlds is a bit thinner during those moments. All right, I am ready for this vampire story now. Like, what exactly did Radbaz write about? What's the story here?
So Radbaz uses this story to illustrate what could happen if those burial practices we talked about, if those were neglected. He was basically saying, hey, take this seriously, folks. It wasn't a joke. The story itself, well, it comes from an anonymous source, and Radbaz included it in his book, Mezudat David.
Mezudat David, okay. So he's basically using a spooky story to make a serious point about religious law.
Right. And it's actually pretty clever when you think about it. People love a good story, right?
Certainly. Okay, give us the details. I'm ready.
All right, picture this. You've got this small village, and in this village, there's this old woman. Now, she's known for being a miser, and she's pretty isolated from the rest of the community. So she dies alone in her home, and because she lived alone, her body isn't found for 3 days.
3 days. Oh, that's not good. Not good at all.
No, not good. Not when you think about those laws we talked about, about swift burial.
Right, right.
So they eventually find her and bury her. But then things take a really dark turn. She starts appearing to sick people in the village. And those people, they start dying shortly after seeing her.
So is she like Attacking them?
Yeah.
Like a classic vampire preying on people?
It wasn't quite like that. People said she was calling out to them, hitting them, and somehow causing their deaths. It was more like a spectral presence rather than a physical attack.
Okay, so more of a ghostly presence.
Yeah, you could say that, but the effect was the same. People were dying. And the death toll, get this, it reached over 200 people in just 40 days.
Oh my gosh, that's like a plague on top of a potential vampire.
Yeah.
It's terrifying. What did the villagers do?
Well, imagine the fear they must have been feeling. In a desperate attempt to stop the deaths, they finally decide to open her coffin.
They opened her coffin. Oh boy, I bet that wasn't pretty.
And this is where the details get really creepy. When they opened the coffin, they found her burial headdress partially swallowed, and blood was flowing from her mouth and her eyes.
Whoa. Okay, that's a seriously vivid and disturbing image.
Yeah, it was like something straight out of a horror movie. It really seemed like they'd confirmed she was a vampire.
So what did they do then?
The villagers were just desperate and driven by fear. They took drastic action. They burned her body.
They burned her body.
Yeah.
But we were just talking about how important proper burial is in Jewish law.
Exactly. It's completely forbidden. But they were so terrified, they felt like they had no other choice.
It's interesting, though, because, like, burning the body, that totally reminds me of classic vampire stories from other cultures. It's amazing how these themes pop up all over the world.
It really is. This idea of, like, the antisocial individual and the mysterious spread of death, and then these extreme measures people take to try to stop this supernatural threat. It's a pattern you see throughout history and in so many different places.
Wow. So we've got this chilling story about a potential Jewish vampire.
Yeah.
But what does it all mean? That's where you come in. You're the expert.
All right, challenge accepted. Let's break this down.
Perfect. I can't wait.
To really understand all this, we have to consider the work of this anthropologist, Paul Barber. He wrote a fascinating book called Vampires, Burial, and Death, and he looked at these vampire stories through, like, all these different lenses: sociology, psychology, even forensic science.
Oh, hold on. Forensic science and vampires. Now I'm really intrigued.
Yeah, it's pretty cool, right? What Barber found was that a lot of vampire stories came from, like, a lack of understanding about disease and decomposition. People would see these strange things happening after someone died and think, oh, it must be supernatural, because they didn't have the scientific knowledge to explain it any other way.
Right. So those details about the woman's body, the blood, the headdress, all that, could those have been caused by, like, natural processes?
Absolutely. Things like bloating, blood, even the appearance of fresh skin, those are all things that can happen as a body decomposes.
That makes sense. But why did they blame this particular woman? Was it just because they didn't understand science? Or was there something more to it?
That is a fantastic question, and it's a really important one. So Barber also points out that social marginalization plays a huge role in these vampire stories. Like, people who were different, isolated, or disliked, they were often the ones blamed when bad things happened, especially outbreaks of illness. They became scapegoats.
So in this story, the old woman, she was already an outsider. So when this terrible thing happened, she was an easy target.
Exactly. It's always easier to point the finger at someone who's already on the fringes of society rather than trying to deal with a more complex explanation.
Right. It's like, oh, it must be her fault. She's different.
Right. But her being an outsider also makes me wonder, was the community neglecting those burial laws, especially Shmira? Was that part of the reason they ended up blaming her? It's like maybe their failure to care for her, even in death, contributed to the panic and fear, and that fear led to those drastic measures.
Whoa. Yeah, that adds a whole other layer to the story. It's not just about an individual being blamed. What about the community's responsibility to care for its members?
Exactly. And I think that's a really crucial point that Rabez was trying to get across.
Wow. Okay. So Radbez tells this creepy story about a potential Jewish vampire.
Mm-hmm.
And then what? What's the takeaway message? What is he trying to teach?
Well, this is where Radbez's purpose becomes really clear. He likely included the story to emphasize those burial laws, like the swift burial and Shmira, those key practices we talked about.
Right.
He was saying, look, if you don't follow these practices, there could be serious consequences, maybe even supernatural consequences.
It's like a spiritual lesson disguised as a horror story. I love it.
Exactly. But I think there's an even deeper meaning here, too. This woman, despite her, her flaws, she was still a member of that community, and they had a responsibility to her, regardless of how she was perceived.
So this story, it's not just about vampires and burial practices. It's about how we treat each other, even in death.
You got it. It's about the sanctity of human life and the responsibility we have to one another.
Man, this is really thought-provoking. There's so much more to this story than meets the eye.
Oh, yeah. And there's still more to uncover. Like, what does this story tell us about Jewish beliefs about the soul? And how does that connect to this idea that all people are created in the image of God?
Okay, hold on. I need to take some notes.
It's a lot to take in, right?
It is. It's fascinating, though. I am hooked. Tell me more.
We were talking about how this story isn't just about this supposed Jewish vampire, right? It's about how we treat each other,
Yeah.
even in death, which is a pretty heavy thing to think about.
It really is. And you mentioned something about the idea that everyone's created in the image of God.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one.
That's a huge concept.
It is. It really is. Jewish tradition emphasizes that every single person, every single one is created in the image of God,
Wow.
which basically means that every person has inherent dignity and worth, like no matter what. And that belief, it even extends beyond death, you know?
So these burial practices we discussed, the swift burial and the Shemira, they're not just some rituals, are they?
No, not at all.
They're like acts of respect for that divine spark
Exactly.
that's within each person.
Precisely. The body, even in death, is treated with so much reverence because it once housed that divine image, you know?
Right.
It's a powerful idea, and it really changes how we understand this whole story.
It makes me think about the community and how they kind of neglected the old woman,
Yeah.
like in a totally new light.
Mm-hmm.
Their failure to make sure she was cared for even after she died.
Mm-hmm.
It almost feels like a violation of that principle,
Yeah.
of inherent dignity.
You're right. It could definitely be seen that way. And Radbaz, he might be using this story to highlight not just the letter of the law, but the spirit behind it.
I see.
A deep respect for all human life, no matter what.
No matter their social standing or their personal qualities.
Exactly.
Wow. That takes the story from like a scary story to a reflection on how we should act, about our responsibility to the community and how we treat everyone ethically.
You put that perfectly.
This is why I love these deep dives, You
Right.
just uncover these hidden layers that I'd never see on my own.
It's really amazing how all these pieces fit together, isn't it?
It is.
Like the folklore, the religious laws, and even like the scientific understanding.
Yep.
They all weave together to create this tapestry of meaning.
Speaking of science, we talked about how some of the vampiric stuff in the story could just be natural decomposition, right?
Right.
Is there more to that?
Yeah.
Like, what else did Paul Barber find out about why people believe in vampires?
Oh, there's definitely more. Remember how we were saying the old woman became a scapegoat?
Yeah.
Well, Barber found that this is something that happens a lot in vampire folklore.
Okay.
When communities were hit with outbreaks of disease, they wanted someone to blame.
Makes sense.
And sadly, a lot of the time, the blame fell on people who were already marginalized or ostracized, you know?
And in this story, it was the old woman who was isolated and, well, people thought she was a miser.
Unfortunately, yeah.
She fit the bill perfectly.
It's sad, really. She was an easy target because she was already on the outside of the community.
Right.
And it's interesting, the word Nosferatu.
Nosferatu,
You know the word for vampire, right? It literally translates to plague carrier.
Wow, I never knew that.
Yeah. So you can really see how closely tied these ideas are.
So these vampire stories, they were a way for people to cope with all the fear and uncertainty that came with disease. Like they needed some way to explain it.
That's exactly it.
They didn't have the medical knowledge we have now.
Right.
So it was supernatural forces.
They were trying to make sense of something that was really scary and confusing.
In this story, it also shows how those explanations, those ways of making sense of things, could be used to do harmful things.
Yeah.
Like burning the body.
Right. Which goes against Jewish law, as we discussed.
It's a reminder that fear and ignorance, when they're together,
Oh, yeah.
they can be really dangerous.
They can lead to actions that go against everything we believe in.
So we've talked about the burial laws, the vampire folklore, the social dynamics, and even some science.
Yeah.
Is there anything else we need to look at?
Actually, yes. There's one more piece of this story that we haven't really touched on yet.
Okay, what is it?
What if this story isn't really about the old woman's death?
What do you mean?
What if it's a metaphor for something bigger?
A metaphor. Okay, now you got me curious.
Remember how Radbaz was really pushing the importance of swift burial and Shemira?
Yeah.
What if those actions represent something beyond, like, the physical stuff?
Okay, I'm listening.
What if they symbolize our responsibilities to each other,
Okay.
but in a much broader sense?
Okay, so not just caring for the body.
Right.
but caring for each other in life.
Exactly. It's like the delayed burial and the lack of Shmira, the neglect of those responsibilities.
Yeah.
It could lead to bad things, not just for one person, but for the whole community.
Whoa!
That's the heart of the metaphor, you see.
That is a really powerful way to look at it.
Right.
It totally changes how I understand the whole thing.
Wow.
It's not just vampires and burials. It's about how connected we are and how we have to take care of each other.
Got it. Radbaz might be using this story to remind us that if we don't take care of each other, there can be some really big consequences for everyone.
For individuals and for the whole community.
Right. It's a call to action hidden in this spooky story about a Jewish vampire.
This is incredible. Who knew a story like this could be so deep?
It's amazing, isn't it?
I need a minute to think about all this.
Yeah, it's a lot to take in. But that's the beauty of these deep dives.
It is.
They spark all these new ideas and challenge what we thought we knew.
And there's always more to learn.
Always.
I'm ready for the last part of this deep dive whenever you are. All right, I'm ready to dive back in. That metaphor idea from the last part really got me thinking. It's incredible how one story can have so much depth to it, you know?
I know, right? It's like peeling back layers of an onion, but in a good way.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into the world of Jewish vampires, what's the one thing you really want our listeners to take away from this?
Well, I think the most important takeaway is how Radbaz used this story, this potential Jewish vampire tale, to connect with people on such a deep level. He was a storyteller, you know, and he knew how to use that power to really drive home the importance of those Jewish burial practices.
And the ethics behind them, right.
Exactly.
Like he took this scary story and turned it into this powerful message about how we need to be responsible for each other and how connected we all are in a community.
That's it. That's the heart of it. He makes us think about some tough questions, you know?
Yeah.
Like, how do we treat the people who are different from us? Do we really live up to our responsibilities in our communities?
And do we really value every human life, even after death?
Exactly. Those are the questions he's raising.
Those are big questions.
They are, but they're important ones to think about. And these stories, even the ones with vampires and supernatural stuff, they can help us wrestle with these ideas in a way that's, you know, it's interesting. It makes you think.
They pull you in, for sure.
They do. And in the end, they help us understand ourselves and each other a little bit better.
This whole deep dive has given me a lot to think about. Any last thoughts you want to share with everyone listening?
Just this. Even though the story is super old, it's still relevant today, you know?
Yeah.
It reminds us that what we do matters, that we're all connected, and that our choices, the choices we make each day, they shape the world around us.
Both as individuals and as a community.
Exactly. It makes you think about the ripple effects of our actions, right?
It does. It's powerful stuff.
It is.
Well, this has been an amazing journey. Thank you so much for guiding us through this deep dive today.
It's been my pleasure, truly. And remember, there's a whole world of folklore and tradition out there just waiting to be explored. Keep learning. Keep digging deeper.
I love it. And to all our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep those brains buzzing.